of people might think this is a cold and miserable winter, and I just thought I would maybe talk a little bit about winter weather in Kansas City for the most part. And actually, to start, I want to say that I was in elementary school in the 70s and grew up partially in the South. We moved to Kansas City in 1978 from Slidell, Louisiana. So that should tell you how far south. We lived on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and Louisiana throughout the 70s up until 1978, from about 73 on. And down there, it's it's well known. You don't really have much of a winter, or you didn't. But the decade of the 70s seemed to be a very cold one. As a matter of fact, I think that 1977 was a record-breaking year as far as cold goes. The winter of 76, 77. And, well, first off, when we first moved to the South, me being an Air Force brat, we moved from a tropical island. We moved from Guam, Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, to Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. And that first year it snowed, and they said maybe it snows down there on the Gulf Coast once every 7 years. Well, we must have got lucky that year. And it snowed probably about like this, maybe a little bit less, just a couple inches, but that kept us out of school for a whole week, if you can believe that. And so yeah, the winter of 76, 77 was really cold, and there was a bad strain of flu going around. I caught it. I was out of school for a week. It didn't snow, but it was icy every day. Like, I remember freezing temperatures every morning, but usually by the afternoons it would get up into the low 40s, which, that's average for winters down there. And then when we moved to Kansas City, it was in one of the worst winter storms that a lot of people could remember. I believe, now it doesn't sound like much maybe, I believe it was 12 inches, a foot of snow. And, we started out in Slidell, Louisiana. I remember that morning it was raining when we left. And we made it to Sardis, Mississippi. And I remember the weather people with their crazy, the weather guy, I think he was out of Memphis, Tennessee, had these crazy little light up clouds that blinked and everything. He'd throw them up on a map and they would stick. That was advanced weather graphics back in 1978. And this was January, about this time of year. And it was threatening that it was going to be freezing rain and then snow from northern Mississippi northward into Tennessee, and especially when you got into Missouri. So I remember we got up the next morning, and of course it was like freezing ice, and it was a novelty to me and my sister. We're winter weather. We hadn't seen that much winter weather in many years living in the South. Well, be careful what you wish for. Then we got up through the boot heel of Missouri. My mom was driving following us. We were driving a Dodge truck. My mom was driving a Ford Gran Torino, which is not a very good car in the snow, and she wiped out. We had to pull her out, and then my dad had to help pull some other people out who were stuck. This was like, what's that highway that goes up the eastern end of Missouri into St. Louis? But by the time we got to St. Louis, it was full-on snow, and I think we hit St. Louis at rush hour in the afternoon. Made it to I-70, and you could hardly see the highway. I remember we stopped at a truck stop and had some food. That's back when truck stop food was actually halfway decent. And, just tons of snow everywhere. And then we got to Kansas City early in the morning. And when we got to Kansas City, it was 12 below zero. This morning, it was 3 below zero Fahrenheit. So, yeah. pretty comparable, except we haven't had as much snow as we did that day. It was around the 15th of January, and then that whole week we were pretty much snowed in. It snowed more, I think, that week, and then and where we stayed is an interesting place. It was our first view of Kansas City, and let me tell you, it was very kind of grim and depressing. Our first impression of Kansas City was not good at all. But the place we stayed was Harlem, a neighborhood called Harlem, which is just across the river from downtown. And we stayed at what was then the Holiday Inn. And it was a motel that was pretty much built for the downtown airport traffic. And I think in many ways it had seen better days. Losing my camera. Nice bumpy roads. It had seen better days, and then it was kind of in decline. My dad at the time was working for the Weather Service, and they had a contract with the government to put up students and transient workers and stuff there. This road, when we first moved here, was not here. It was actually a block over there, and there was a bridge that went across the railroad tracks. And I believe it was not soon after we moved here. I think we were still living in Excelsior Springs. I mean, we loved it. It was convenient to get south pretty easy. And then something happened to the bridge. I think I may be wrong, but a truck or something ran into the pier of the bridge and ruined the bridge. So they tore the bridge down, and they kept the road shut forever until they opened this up. And it was really inconvenient because you had to go blocks out of your way to get back and forth this way. But so when we first moved here in January 1978, and we were living across in Harlem at the Holiday Inn, there was a really bad fire. It killed quite a few people, and from what I understand, I think what was portrayed back then, it was an old hotel called the Coates House, and it was one of these at one time grand old hotels, but at the time it was in a neighborhood in an area that had fallen on hard times. It was kind of seedy. It was what we euphemistically call now a long extended stay hotel, cheap rent, and it was a bad thing because it burned a whole wing of the hotel, and it also killed, I believe it was 14 people, including children. And there were people who couldn't get out in time. It was really, really cold. It was January. The temperatures were, I think, less than zero by far. I mean, it was after that winter storm that we drove up in, and there was all sorts of bad things going on. The firefighters were having a hard time dealing with the cold, and the Kansas City Star, or was it? They were kind of, they were the same newspaper. I think it depended on the time of day. I think at one time they were two newspapers, but don't quote me on that. Back then it was the Kansas City Times and the Kansas City Star, and I can't remember which one ran but there was a picture that they showed, and it was pretty horrific because you could actually see one of the people's bodies in the windows. I think it was kind of controversial. You could see them in the window, frozen in place, like they were trying to get to the window and didn't make it, and then when the water filtered down, I mean, it looked like one of those World War II pictures, the wing of the hotel that had been completely destroyed. And unfortunately, I can't drive fast enough. I'm driving the speed limit or less, And I'm trying to get to the Coates house because it still stands. It's been restored. And this is it right up here. And if you ever look at the Coates house, now I gotta drive slow. It was this wing right here. There used to be a whole wing that came to this corner right here, and that's what burned down. Well, not to this corner, but and that's why the Coates house has sort of a truncated look, because that part burned down and it was terrible. And this whole area west of here is called Quality Hill, and back in the 70s, not so much. It wasn't very quality. It was a lot of abandoned places, and let's just say that when you pass through this part of town, and all of downtown was in a terrible, terrible decline in the 70s. It wasn't pretty at all. But you know, the joke about roll your windows up and lock the doors, well, that's kind of what you did. And it was because it was just a lot of drugs and prostitution and, you know, stuff on all the street corners that was just not nice. And my parents worked downtown. My mom used to drive downtown and park, but they didn't want to pay for the downtown parking, so she'd park about a block off downtown. Well, that didn't work, because then she'd come out and find that her battery would be cut, not taken out of the car, but literally cut, so that you have to rewire the whole thing. Just cut the battery cables and pull it out. And that happened 2 or 3 times, and it was decided that it's better to take the bus. So yeah, you know, Kansas City weather. Now I've delved into downtown. It's a steep decline in the 70s. It started reversing itself in the early 80s. Quality Hill was redeveloped, and that sort of began the trend to redevelop and start moving back downtown. 1981, I believe, this was a toll bridge, and some might say that's why areas of the Northland are undeveloped, because people didn't want to pay the toll every day to cross this bridge. But if you see Broadway Bridge here where it gets wide, if you ever wonder why it's wide here, that's because that's where the toll booths were. Now it's a convenient place to pull over if you ever need to, or if you want to just get a nice scenic view of the river here. And what we're coming up on up here by the airport is Harlem. Matter of fact, I'm talking about it. Why don't I go see it? Harlem back in the 70s wasn't a great area either. It never really was a great area. I don't think it's a great area now. But back in the 70s, it was actually a small little community. There's a church here that still stands. That's pretty much what's left of the community. There's a sign there that says Harlem. And when we first came to Kansas City, this is where we stayed for a week until we can get more permanent lodging. This was the Holiday Inn, and now it's apartments. It was really nice back in the 70s. We always thought it had a nice lounge. It has a courtyard with a swimming pool. I don't know if it's still there. And all this industrial area was not here. This was all like houses, and maybe that gas station has been there a while. But I remember a lot more houses here. People actually lived here. The church had always been here. But it wasn't, Harlem Baptist Church. It wasn't a lot of people that lived down here. I mean, it was more like there's a couple of the houses left over here. But, you know, you see a lot of streets that don't seem to go anywhere. It's because there were little neighborhoods in here. And Harlem is the where the old Pike Road ended, and the ferry across the river, because there wasn't, in the 1800s, there weren't bridges across. There was only one bridge, the Hannibal Bridge, which was a railroad bridge. So to get across the river, especially if you were a farmer and you wanted to get to the farmer's market, you had to take a ferry here at Harlem. And that's, I think, pretty much why Harlem existed. But anyway, I'll end it here and stop. There's a train. We're at the south end of the Burlington Northern Yards, Burlington Northern Santa Fe now. And that's a little bit of Kansas City history and climate. Oh, except for one thing. Speaking of climate, 1980, I started out talking about cold weather. 1980 was one of the hottest years ever. And I was a kid, and summer vacation, and used to hang out with our dog. We had a Brittany Spaniel back then, and that year, almost every day in the summer, from June until August, was over 100 degrees. No rain. And we also had quite a few days where it wasn't just over 100, it was like 120 plus. I mean, record-breaking heat. It was almost like the end of the world. Everybody's like, oh, we're gonna die. And the winters back then, after the 1978 winter, 1979 was pretty cold, but I think the winters kind of moderated. By the early 80s, it actually went from being moderated winters to warm winters. We had some winters where we had hardly any snow. We would walk around in January. I was in the Scouts, and we do our winter campouts, which would usually be indoor kind of things, like going to Central Missouri State University or going to the National Guard Armory at Jefferson City. And we were walking around in short sleeves and shorts, and it was warm. It was like 80 degrees in January and February. And then I remember that one year, I think it was 1982, maybe it was 83. We did that, and then our supposed first spring camp out in March, we had freezing rain, and most of us ended up not being as prepared and sleeping in our cars because our tents all blew over and water got in them. And so anyway, and then throughout the 80s, I mean, I think overall the 1980s were a lot of warm winters. Into the 2000s, I can't remember too many spectacularly cold winters until 2000. What was it, 2010 or 2009? I don't know, I have to look it up. But we had a blizzard and a really cold, snowy winter. And then it's since stepped back from that, or we've actually had a couple of winters without winter. So anyway, that's that. I'll leave it here as I watch a train go by. Coal train from, I think it's going to Lacine, because it says Lacine Generating Station. Lacine is south of here. Anyways,